In the 1890s, the world's biggest businesses, railroads, shipping, oil, textiles, were controlled by a handful of men, the so-called robber barons. They brought a new efficiency to American industry, making it globally dominant. But there had never been such concentrations of power and wealth. Some believe this history is being repeated.
I think Facebook has grown too big and too powerful.
Chris Hughes founded Facebook with Mark Zuckerberg, but cashed out in 2007.
Americans have the power to right the ship through government action. We need new regulations. It's time to break up Facebook.
Around the world, regulators and lawmakers are casting a critical eye at the impact and practices not just of Facebook with its 3 billion users, but Google, which has 92% of the worldwide search market, and Apple, and Alibaba, and Amazon, which accounts for almost 40% of e-commerce in the US.
Convenience is the commodity that matters most to our generation. I can't believe I used to physically go to stores, take money out of my pocket and pay for stuff like a peasant. With Amazon, I just do this, and things come to me like I'm an emperor.
Critics say these monster-sized companies are harmful, squashing competition, stifling innovation, controlling the information we see, vacuuming up our data, compromising our privacy, some say even threatening democracy. But big tech says it is enriching the global economy by facilitating commerce and communication.
It's really important that politicians and others they need to understand the value that big companies bring and not demonize or vilify business in general, or especially not business. Well, they shouldn't vilify big companies and they shouldn't vilify business in general for sure. And the reason is simple. There are certain things only big companies can do.
Like give us convenience at low cost, connecting us at no cost. Though as they do, their size, wealth, and influence continue to grow.
Please welcome to the stage Denise Hearn, Sally Hubbard, Amy Pagnarvi, and our session moderator, Patty Lovett-Reed.
I'm going to start by saying I don't work for the media. No, I do. And, I am absolutely delighted to be here today. This is our conversation. It's around monopoly or market improvement. I am with CTV News. I'm the chief financial commentator. I'm proud to say that CTV is part of Bell Media, and Bell Media is owned by BCE, and BCE has been a partner of the International Women's Forum and its Leadership Foundation for more than 20 years. Now, in a lead up to the panel discussion, we did ask you a question, and here was the question. Do you believe that the business models of big technology, companies like Google, Facebook, Alibaba, and Amazon, have been positive or negative for consumers? And the poll results show, well, yeah, that's pretty decisive. Okay. So, did you see the results, everyone? Very good. All right, so I'm going to turn now to my panelists. Has there been a time in modern history that has come even close to matching these companies when it comes to their ability to reach consumers, influence our culture, our politics, and ourselves? And I will start with Ame.
Thank you, Patty. I think the answer is no. Should I stop there?
No.
And it's not just everything you just sort of spoke about, the ability to reach, the ability to service, the ability to do all kinds of amazing things that most of us enjoy on a daily basis. But I think it's the ability to connect all of these things and learn from sort of usage experience and learn from what people are actually doing on the platforms and then build new things on top of that. So that I think is unique for the time that we're living in at the moment.
Sally, do you have an opinion that may be slightly different here?
Sure.
I had a chance to talk to them over lunch. Just going to say.
I think the ability to connect is a wonderful thing. But what I'm mostly concerned about is the concentrated power and control. And I don't think we've seen anything like this, except for the robber barons, actually, that was shown as we were entering the stage here. And my concern always is that these companies are controlling the game and playing it too. And unlike the robber barons, these are global monopolies. So the extent of the control is much broader than we've ever seen.
Denise, you can weigh in, and then we'll open it up again.
Sure. So I think it's important to emphasize that when we talk about monopoly power, it's not just that companies want to control an industry. What we're seeing with a lot of modern, not only tech giants, but also in other industries, is that they want to control the fundamental infrastructure on which business gets done. So you see this with Amazon, with Google Search, something that's arguably now a global utility like search or even like logistical networks. You see companies wanting to control access and those entire infrastructure markets and conduct business on top of that as well. And so that's the concerning piece to me.
So could I just ask then, and this may seem very basic, but has personal data then become almost a human right? Anyone wanting to weigh in? This is the participative part.
Do you mean personal data or sort of the right to control your personal data?
The right to control.
Because there,
I
think
yes,
there's a huge difference. Like all of us, I myself, I know Facebook is outdated and all that kind of stuff, but I'm on Facebook quite actively, and I realize that what I put on Facebook is no longer personal to me. I've published it at least in the sort of limited scope that I usually tick, just friends or whatever, not totally public. But then I guess what gets a bit more tricky is so what is done with that, not with what I have published, but where I was when I published it, who I am, where my children go to school, and so on and so forth. And I think that is the sort of the part where we get to the sort of difficult discussion about what is your right to privacy about? What do you actually control in a situation where you use social media or some other platform that actually, in a way, you waive your right to that or your privacy to that thing that you're doing because you're doing it publicly?
So I'm obviously always late to the game when it comes to technology, Sally, and now just into Instagram. And so I have waived all that right. Is that a concern? For real? The way you looked at me.
I don't think we can put the burden on the average person to have read, terms and conditions that go on for miles that actually, if you read them, you would never be able to hold down a job if you read all the different terms and conditions that you encounter on a daily basis. And I think there's actually a massive kind of deceptive fraud on really people around the world that they think that Facebook knows about them only what they have told Facebook. Mm-hmm. And so there's this victim blaming that, Facebook only knows I was dumb to post those things. What you post on Facebook is a tiny, tiny fraction of what Facebook knows about you. Because Facebook has monitoring technology on all of the top millions of websites. So it's tracking every website you visit. It's tracking purchases that you make. It's tracking your location based on the app. It's combining that with data sets that it's buying from data brokers. So the amount that these companies have acquired, the amount of information about us that they have acquired is so much more vast than anything that we've willingly put forth. And I think that's been a deception that's been allowed because it is profitable and that it does further their business models.
Denise, you made the decision, you watched, like I did, The Great Hack on Netflix. That's not all the research I did for today, but it does open up your eyes for anyone who has seen it. But you made the decision to say, I've been thinking about it for a while. and I'm off of social media.
Yes, I did delete my Facebook and Instagram about 2 months ago, and my life is no the worse off. Shockingly. No, I think there's a distinction to be made between the vast amounts of data that are being hoovered up, as Sally mentioned, and then also the ability for that data to be used for targeted surveillance, which is of concern. I was actually born in Toronto. I recently was asked to speak about the sidewalk projects that's happening here with Alphabet's parent company, Sidewalk Labs, redeveloping the waterfront. And I think there's been a lot of discussion around concerns about data and data privacy. My concern is what the companies can accomplish with this data and the way that they vertically integrate across their hardware, their software, and their vast data troves to essentially create monopolies on things like mobility, which again is a public utility. So Google envisions a world where you will not visit a city around the world where you do not leave the Google-supported ecosystem, whether that's through their software or their hardware. And you providing the data for them to sort of create this vertical integration and this synthesis is part of what is going to allow them to maintain these incredibly problematic monopolies. And so I think we need to keep that in mind. It's not just about what you share on Facebook. It's about how this data is combined, recombined, and used to shore up a moat around their business that is already becoming quite impenetrable and will only continue to be so in the future.
Denise, can I stick with you then? And let's talk a little bit about income inequalities. It's a concern when you have a monopoly. And to what extent are you worried about that?
Yeah, so I became really interested in trying to understand the structural drivers of economic inequality because a lot of the conversation that we have I felt was very symptomatic. And we talk about taxing the rich, which is great, but you're actually, what you're doing with that is you're treating a symptomatic issue rather than addressing the concentration at the get-go. And so I ended up co-authoring a book called The Myth of Capitalism, which is actually pro-capitalist. And what we found when we dug into the research is that concentration of industries is a huge driver of structural inequality because it affects workers. It affects, we are all paying higher prices. Any Canadians in the room here, how's your latest cell phone bill? How's your airline ticket? Canadians pay some of the highest prices worldwide for airline tickets, for banking fees, because our economy has been dominated by oligopolistic industries for decades. The same in the U.S. And so what we see is that you actually, when you have this level of concentration in the economy, we have fewer small businesses starting or businesses at any size, less productivity. Half of all public firms have disappeared in the last 20 years. So this has real far-reaching economic consequences beyond simply tech. And that's what we tried to uncover in our research in the book.
Sally, would you like to weigh in on that?
On income inequality?
Or even just the market concentration and the impact that it has on women?
Yeah, sure. There has been a lot of great research about the connection between market concentration and income inequality, but I was one of the first people to write about how I thought monopolies amplified gender inequality. And I want to tell you a quick story about how that came to me, it was like the end of 2017, and I was honestly just completely burnt out. And this was because I had started a podcast called Women Killing It, where I was interviewing rock star women and trying to create a playbook for what works for women at work. And then I was also full-time investigating and writing about all the ways that I saw that the tech platforms were violating antitrust law. And as you all remember, in 2016, 2017, these issues just completely exploded. So I was totally burnt out. And I said to myself, Sally, you've just got to pick one of these passions. You cannot keep doing both. But I couldn't tear myself away from either one. And that's when it came to me. I couldn't believe I hadn't realized it sooner, but it was really just the same passion. And what that passion was for equal opportunity, or as we call it in America, the American dream. And when you think about it, monopolization and sexism, they do the same thing. They deprive people of the opportunity to compete on the merits. The monopolies deprive small companies of the opportunity to compete on the merits, or even large companies these days. And, sexism deprives women of the opportunity to compete on the merits, right? So the glass ceiling is really just a cartel, right? That's all it is. So I put this all together, and I decided to really look into how do monopolies amplify gender inequality. And a lot of the things that Denise was just mentioning have a disproportionate effect on women. So you have less employers competing for labor. That drives wages down. Well, we know there's a gender pay gap, so then women are making even a smaller percentage of a smaller amount of dollars. They have less bargaining power, and there are certain things that women need bargaining power for that men don't need it for, like getting maternity leave. Women have greater needs for mobility, lateral mobility, especially escaping hostile work environments. You need to have alternatives of several different companies to choose from, not just one other competitor in your industry. So I put that all together, and I was like, well, the antitrust lawyers are going to tell me I'm crazy, but I'm doing this anyway. And it's been amazing because I was asked to speak at the OECD about it, and now there's a whole actually school of thought, economists and researchers that are studying it. So I'm very excited about that.
Woo-hoo. Amay, do you have a slightly different perspective, though, on monopolies and where... I guess if I were to summarize what I think from a business perspective, sometimes monopolies are thought of as being very inefficient just by virtue of their nature. Does it depend on cycle?
Before I answer that, I just want to say I love your quote about, or your statement about the glass ceiling being just one big cartel, and I'm going to steal that with your permission, if you allow. That's a really good one.
Yeah.
Really good one. Yeah, I mean, for me, the question really is to a large extent, sort of, at what point is a product or a service where a clear monopoly is sort of building up? Where does it tip into being non-innovative and actually inhibiting further development and innovation and these sort of things? Because oftentimes when you look at monopolies at the beginning of their sort of, or the big innovators, if you like, they are not monopolies to start off with. Somebody just makes it big, and they are the first. They're first movers, if you like. We have something we call first mover advantage, which is good until it gets bad, basically. Or
and at what point does it get bad? When they're no longer innovative, creative, and leader of the pack?
I think it gets bad once they start using it in a non-ethical way, quite frankly. And it was mentioned earlier in the AI panel that sort of big tech and big innovator companies have a special responsibility to behave in a particular way because they do sort of hold and harness so much power. And I think that's the clue. That's where we need to get to. And if we want to regulate in these kinds of things, that's what we need to be looking at, not stifling innovation or asking companies to do less or be less powerful. I think big companies and strong operators are allowed to be first movers if they make it on the merits. But then once we get to the point where it's starting to get almost sort of like an essential facility for society, then we have to be sure that it's being run in a way that works for everyone and is sort of somehow abides by the rules.
Well, along those lines, we did ask the audience to say, big technology companies, should they be regulated? And here are the poll results.
Wow.
Oh,
well,
that's interesting.
Okay, so I'll turn it back over to you then, Amay. What do you think about regulation? Like, at what point does it actually have to happen, and can it happen then?
Well, my personal view is that no company or no industry should escape the basic rules that we have for particular situations. So the same rules should apply to companies now and in the future, independent of what they do and independent of which sector they are in. There's a lot of talk in Europe, where I come from, that should we have new rules? Does big tech need sort of sector-specific rules, if you like? I personally think that we've been able to deal with everything that's come along with the same rules for, I don't know, 50, 60 years now. And I don't think we need new rules, but we maybe need a little bit of guidance and tools on how to use those rules in the current situation and with these particular companies who happen to be very innovative in their way of operating on the market as well. So I'm not saying they're sort of circumventing the rules, but they're very good at coming up with new ways of operating, which may not fit squarely into the sort of buckets of regulation that we have.
So when you think about that, though, what served someone well in the past doesn't always serve them well going forward. Sally, I'm going to switch to you here, because when I think about, I was jotting down as you were speaking, consumers value these company services, the conveniences that they provide. Breaking them up or changing the rules as we know them, would that punish the success that they've achieved?
Yeah, so I advocate for strong anti-monopoly laws and enforcement, and I don't believe in punishing for success. And I agree with Ami that it's not about, and in fact, the way antitrust law is structured, it's not about punishing for success, because there's two requirements for monopolization under US antitrust law. You have to have both monopoly power, and you have to engage in what they call exclusionary conduct. Exclusionary conduct is a very boring legal term, so what I like to call it is wimpy tricks. Wimpy tricks.
Could you elaborate on that just a little?
So what we want companies to do is to duke it out and compete on the merits, right? We don't want them to wimp out and just pull levers because they have the power to do it and kick the competitor out of the game altogether. Instead of taking on their competitor and competing with them, what we're seeing from the major tech monopolies and other monopolies in our economy is that they're using their monopoly power to exclude the competitors altogether. It's like if you go to a baseball game and you only saw one team on the field because they own the stadium and they didn't let the other team in, right? So if a company is just big because they're the best, I don't have any problem with, then antitrust enforcement doesn't need to apply. But unfortunately, it's kind of a natural cycle that once you get to a point of having the ability to pull those levers and kick out competitors, there aren't many companies that decide not to, right? It's quite tempting. And we have to always remember that corporations under current law are profit-maximizing entities. And if we forget that, we get really led astray. So we can't expect them to choose courses of behavior that are not profit-maximizing. So I really believe enforcing the existing laws that we have not been enforcing them sufficiently, could solve a lot of these problems.
As I often do for research, we have 4 adult children, and they were up at our cottage on the weekend. Denise, I am going somewhere with this, and my daughter was complaining about the fact she works for a hospital that has one printer. They, like a print shop. So they get to dictate pricing, they get to dictate timing, and they frustrate the heck out of her. And that's really where the conversation went. But Denise, it did also touch on market concentration. If it's not diluted, what happens next? Like, what do you do?
Well, and I think in a way the technology companies are more difficult to talk about because we all experience such immense benefits from what they have provided for us. But I think it's so important to underscore that this level of concentration is happening across so many industries, including things like funeral services. And things that are not globally tradable goods where you're not going to shop around when your loved one passes away to find the best deal on a funeral. And yet we've seen increased levels of concentration. And so I guess the point being, it's everywhere. It's beer, it's airlines, it's kidney dialysis. In the United States, it's local hospitals. And when we see that level of concentration, of course, then we've seen increased markups hugely. So consumers are paying higher prices. We're seeing workers, have less agency, as Sally mentioned, and essentially the winner-take-all framework, which I think is quite a masculine framework, honestly. Women, we don't tend to, in the same ways, sort of think about dominance and competitiveness. Maybe this is I don't know. Please tell me if you disagree. But I've been looking at natural systems, I've been looking at ecological systems as a template of asking what kind of systems do we actually want to emulate. And you rarely see, monocropping turn out well. What it does is it makes monopolized sort of ecological systems become very fragile and susceptible to breakdown, susceptible to disease, and I think that when we need to sort of ask ourselves what types of economies are we wanting to create in the future. I see this conversation as sitting on top of another more theoretical philosophical conversation about what is the next economy? What kind of economies do we want to be creating together? And I would hope that it includes ones that are more decentralized, where power is shared instead of concentrated and held, and ones in which we can all flourish and sort of there's a symbiosis. We've been told that we're naturally competitive under neoliberal dogma, but actually, capitalism is one of the most cooperative systems that we humans have ever created, and that tends to get lost in conversation. And so I would like to see us engage those questions that sit underneath this question about monopoly power.
So, Amay, I'm going to take this over to you then and say, okay, how do we then make sure that we enable innovation as opposed to really stifle it so that the next generation continues to grow?
Wow. That's a really good question, and it's probably, I'm tempted to say it's sort of a €1 million question, because I think a lot of the focus now is on the EU and the European Commissioner for Competition, who's, by the way, a superwoman, Margaret Vestager from Denmark, and I think this is something she's very much looking at right now, and I don't have the answer, but I think it's telling that she has been not only put in charge for a second term, by the way, for competition enforcement in Europe, which is hasn't happened very, very often. Usually it's one commissioner, one term, and then you're out and somebody else comes in. But she's been put in charge for a second term, partly because she was strong enough to go after big tech. And I say go after, it sounds really negative, but actually what I think she's doing is trying to have a dialogue with the companies to find joint solutions and find ways of sort of allowing them to flourish. And this is my answer to your question, finally. Allowing them to flourish whilst making sure that we're harnessing the power, which is becoming quite immense. And I don't think it's a coincidence either that she's been put in charge of the digital strategy as well of the European Union. So we're clearly seeing sort of competition and antitrust laws and the digital economy being intertwined in a way that at least a very sort of wise group of people in Europe have decided that this one lady has the power to change and to make the decisions required. And I think that's amazing.
Yeah, impressive. Sally, do you want to weigh in on that as well?
Sure. I strongly believe that antitrust enforcement and opening up markets so that they're free and competitive enables and promotes innovation. In fact, we've seen it in Americans' history when we did do things like break up AT&T, that it brought a whole new, wave of innovation came forward. Because as long as you have a few companies that are controlling who can enter the market, you don't maximize innovation. And we're seeing that right now with the tech giants, that they basically have what are called kill zones around them, that if you want to compete with them, a VC won't fund you because they think you're going to fail. So you can't get funded to compete with them. So the kind of innovation that we're seeing are kind of the narrow types of innovations that you might think they want to acquire, which is not really the next big leapfrog innovation. And it also means we've got, basically four dudes, Larry, Jeff, Mark, and Tim, setting the course of innovation for the whole world, right? Because if you're only innovating if you can get acquired by them, they're setting the direction of innovation. And I think they've been innovating us. They do lots of great things, and I'm never trying to say that they don't offer any value. It's kind of like if you saw a factory that was pluming toxic smoke into the air. It might be making a really valuable good, but you still want it to stop pluming the toxic smoke into the air. Like, it can keep making the valuable product. But my point is we're getting this very narrow view of what innovation should be because so few actors, and they're all white men at the top of, the vast majority at the top of these organizations, innovating us in one direction, which really has been away from democracy. And we have a lot of innovators waiting in the wings with privacy protecting technologies, with all kinds of technologies that if they could just get through the gates, they would have an opportunity to improve and solve a lot of these problems for us. But the problem is you can't get onto an Android phone because Google's own apps are on it. You can't get onto the, there's a Brave browser, which is a privacy protecting browser. But it's not going to be the default on anyone's phone. So, we need to unlock those gates so that these innovations can come forward.
All right, well, then that does take me to the next poll. It makes all kinds of sense. We asked the audience if they supported more aggressive regulation of big tech companies, yes or no. And the results show?
All right.
Yes. So then, Sally, does this surprise you?
I'm happy.
I know. Does Mark Zuckerberg want regulation?
Yeah, we can't listen to Mark Zuckerberg about the regulation.
I know. I think that's true.
When he was making recommendations, I got pretty mad because I said he has the power to solve all of the problems that he wants government to come in and fix. And it's literally just changing the business model. The business model that Facebook has, which is engagement prioritizing algorithms that are targeted at you based on surveillance, individual news feeds. So many of the problems of polarization, disinformation, amplification, the algorithm actually amplifies the content that's hateful and the content that makes you angry and scared. These could all be fixed, but Facebook made $56 billion last year doing things the way that it's doing it. So it's not going to do it willingly. It's going to require, it's going to be dragged to it.
Then I'm going to just add on to this then, but there is a speed to innovation. And when you think about regulation and innovation happening as fast as it does, how do you keep the pace, Ame?
Yeah, that is so the problem, and has been the problem for many, many decades. I mean, some of you will remember Microsoft being investigated by the European Union 20 years ago, I think. And it had a massive global monopoly on operating systems, and all the world's computers, but nearly all, ran on I can't even remember what it was called, but anyway, their operating system, and that as default had their search engine intertwined with it, and so there was a process that took probably like 5 years for the European Commission to investigate. They were cooperating with the US DOJ and FTC and everybody, but it just took too long, and the end result was basically that Microsoft was forced to provide a product that was the alternative to this monopoly product, and like 9 people in the whole world bought it. So we had moved on, like eons on already. So I think that the largest concern at the moment in sort of the community I come from is basically that, okay, if we do need to regulate, we do need to oversee, but if we do that, it can't take years. Investigating cannot take years, so there needs to be a fast track somehow. And I think if we listen to Commissioner Vestager, her idea is that fast track is dialogue. And we need to come to a conclusion and a solution with the companies together, even if we have to drag Mark, from his hair to the table. That's the only way we're going to find a solution. And they're called settlement decisions in the EU. And there should be some sort of format that, in those that would help us further, because otherwise we'll just be sort of running constantly after
trying
the
to catch
innovators.
up.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I
Yes,
respectfully
absolutely.
disagree? So I'm not a regulator, of course. And of course these are incredibly complex. But actually, I think that what we fail to remember is that it's not necessarily about the speed of innovation. I think it's about the ineffectiveness of the current regulatory bodies because of the regulatory capture. I mean, all the tech giants spent huge amounts, record amounts on lobbying last year for this specific reason. We have the mechanisms and the understanding to be able to create some effective regulations, not only antitrust, but sector-specific regulation. And of course, it's complex, and we don't want to get it wrong. But at the same time, the reason why it tends to take so long and why essentially we've had, a complete decline in antitrust enforcement over the last 40 years is not because people don't know how to do it. It's because they don't have the political will. And because they've been essentially captured by this concentrated economic power, which can then buy political power. And so I think that's really important to remember. And also, I had one other point. What was it? Shoot. Maybe I'll just leave it there.
I have a point to make. Maybe you can come back and remember yours. First of all, yeah, I definitely want to amplify this point about when you have concentrated economic power, that translates to concentrated political power. So, monopolies by their nature, when you have so much concentration, it starts to really threaten democracy because you have such concentrated political power and influence over the decision making, and you have lawmakers who are more beholden to the giants than they are to the citizens they represent. But also on Microsoft, it did take forever for that case to go through. But many people say, and I think this is true, that if it were not for that antitrust enforcement against Microsoft, Google would not exist. And the reason was because Microsoft was saying, hey, computer makers, you want our operating system. Oh, yeah, you have to have our operating system to sell a computer, so you have no choice. You also must take our browser and not let a competing browser come in. And that's how they killed Netscape, right? And that's what that case was about. And if that enforcement hadn't happened, what would have stopped Microsoft from being like, oh, there's a search engine that's coming along? No, it's going to be Microsoft's, right? So many people believe if it weren't for that, we would not have Google. And what I think all the tech giants now are doing is the same thing, leveraging their monopoly power in one market to take over any market that touches that market, that monopoly.
So if I can, just on Google, because I reported on it this past week, one element, they're collecting health data. They are also late to the game when you get into banking and that sort of thing. But they want to get closer and more exposure to your digital life. Why are you looking at me like that? Is that true? Did I do fake news? No.
No, it's true. It was. I mean, it was really some of the worst Google news I've seen, and I've seen a lot of bad Google news, but this was really terrible. I mean, it was a agreement with a healthcare system where they were actually collecting all of their medical information, including their name, including their medications.
Everything.
It was not even de-identified, and they were working with monopoly healthcare systems. And the fact that they wouldn't even bother to do the most basic de-identification, I think, was really troubling. And then that the patients, neither the patients nor the doctors knew this was happening. So that was incredibly problematic, and I think it should really inform antitrust enforcers' views as they're looking at the other acquisition that Google's trying to do right now, a Fitbit. And just, when we're talking about healthcare information that's supposed to have private protection, and then combining that with all the data sets that Google already has. Google knows more about you than any other company. It might know more about you than you know about yourself. Then combining that with this very important and private data, I think is highly problematic.
All right, so that takes me to another poll question, because personal data is the basis of the business model for many companies. And I'm sure there are people here, and there are a lot of people that I talk to who are alarmed by how much that they are collecting, that they are retaining, and how they're using it. So here's what we asked. Just how concerned are you on a scale of 1 to 4? Here we go. And the results say... All right, moderately concerned, and then very concerned when you skew. Denise, do I dare ask you what camp you would be in?
Oh, I'm sure it's fairly obvious at this point.
I know.
I'm happy to see that no one is not concerned, so that's great.
So your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I spoke to that a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
I think we really have to get out of the mind frame of thinking about it from an individual perspective, where it's about your, because I hear people say all the time, oh, well, I've got nothing to hide, why does it matter? These are fundamental questions about our democracy. I actually just saw randomly on Twitter this morning that there's a group of people going around doing facial scans of Congress members to try to incentivize them to think about data privacy and and the use of particularly of facial recognition. And I think I also saw something yesterday where in the UK they were thinking of doing facial recognition as you get on the tube, so that you could just pay for your fare, by walking in. And we've already seen this with Amazon Go. They have a grocery store where you can walk in and take your groceries off the shelf and walk out, and they use facial recognition and link it to your Amazon account. And I guess the thing that frustrates me about all of this is that how much we're willing to give up in the name of convenience. Such that, I don't have to dig my card out of my purse to tap into the tube. Or Google Home and Alexa, is it really worth you giving up your last vestige of privacy in your own personal home such that you can ask Alexa to turn your volume up for you audibly? I just consider the trade-offs of what this technology is doing and what it can do. There's ample evidence, even just personal anecdotes of, I'm just audibly talking to a friend about The Lion King, and I open Twitter and there's an ad for The Lion King. I converse with my Uber driver in Spanish, and all of a sudden I'm getting Spanish ads for Telemundo. I've never even entered this into my search engine. So, it's clear that the reach of the hoovering up of all of this data and the surveillance is only getting more and more problematic. And I just would ask everyone to consider, the far-reaching consequences, not just about, it doesn't matter to me because I have nothing to hide.
I was just going to ask you. Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
I just wanted to comment to that I work in a profession. I'm an attorney. I work in a profession which is very much sort of banking on confidentiality. And we nowadays have a policy in the firm that when you walk into, at least, if not all, at least certain meetings, you need to leave your phone outside the room, because we just don't trust that the phone isn't listening to our clients' private issues.
Wow.
So.
But in Europe, though, are there not general data protection regulation when it comes to your personal data?
Yes, we love GDPR. Not only because... I
had to look that up just to be honest, yeah.
It was like the biggest thing, let's say about a year ago. So it's basically a European level data privacy regulation, which was implemented into the laws of all the European Union member states, or had to be implemented by, I think it was May 2018. Some countries didn't quite make it, but most did, and now everyone has implemented by now. And basically it stems from the sort of fundamental right, which is at the core, I think, of European law in general, and maybe differentiates us from some other jurisdictions in the world, and why GDPR and sort of the concerns around it are very strongly coming from Europe. We have the fundamental right to privacy, which is at the sort of core of data protection. So the idea is that for any information about yourself, we call them data subjects, but that's basically people. So any information about any data subject has to be protected to a pretty high level. And then you also have to have the right to ask any operator, basically any company or any public entity, what data they have on you, and they should be able to produce that in a relatively short amount of time. And if you want, you can ask them to remove it also, so not to use it anymore. And it's been in force. I mean, we've had the fundamental right for decades already, but this GDPR regulation has been in force now for some time, and I think it's working pretty well. I mean, we've also seen very high fines being levied already in the EU for breaches of this, so millions and millions of euros being fined, or companies being fined large amounts of money.
Denise, is that happening here in Canada?
No, I don't believe so, actually. The Competition Bureau, last time I checked, last time I did my research, the largest fine that they had doled out was something like, $12 million. And it was like, it made like, Competition Bureau history, which is just, it's such a drop in the bucket, right? And yeah, I think the same thing that we're seeing in the United States around the enforcement agencies being somewhat impotent when it comes to actually not only delivering fines, but taking an aggressive stance and Europe has done a much better job at actually preempting some of this by identifying markets that seem like they're under threat in terms of anti-competitive behavior and taking more of a proactive approach, whereas we just do not see that in Canada or the US.
Okay, so I was going to ask you then, Sally, if it did happen in the U.S., because it seems to me that there may be something happening in California, some groundswell around this.
Yeah, so the California privacy law is taking effect in January, and I'm optimistic about that. There's already been a newer version put forward they're trying to pass to clean up some of the shortcomings in the California version. Simultaneously, however, the tech lobbyists are working at the federal level to try to get a very weak privacy law that would preempt the California state law. So it would nullify the California state law by having a federal law that controls. And so that is right now being crafted by the tech lobbyists. So I am trying to...
You're so optimistic that this is going to go the way you'd like to see it.
I'm hoping that the activists can shed light on what's happening and mobilize enough public opposition that they get some real protections. I will say on GDPR, I think it's a great step in the right direction. I don't think any of the tech giants are fully complying with it right now. And I recently met with all of the world's data protection commissioners in Albania 2 weeks ago to talk about it. And they assured me that it's just a matter of time. But I don't currently see it being enforced robustly enough. And so I'm hopeful that change will come, but I haven't seen the changes that it was intended to create yet.
So while we're talking about monopolies and the market, and we've talked about personal data and regulation, innovation, but I haven't really gotten into salaries, compensation, inequality, board diversity, leadership diversity. I'd like each of you to weigh in on that as we get sort of ticking the clock down. I want to make sure I touch on it. Denise, can I put you on the hot seat?
Sure. So in terms of sort of other effects of monopoly power?
Yeah. Or are we? Are there inefficiencies to that extent in terms of leadership, diversity at the board level, at the top of the corporations, we know who's leading them, but also from a compensation perspective, salaries?
Sure. So we use this term monopoly to describe a situation where there's one seller. There's a term for when there's one buyer, and that's called a monopsony. And that is tended to be talked about when you're talking about the buying power of companies for buying labor. And there is all kinds of evidence that when you're in highly concentrated employment markets where there is monopsony power for the firms, that it suppresses wages. The other thing that's important to note too is that when we talk about, well, so I guess I can also speak. So I used to work for this macroeconomic research firm that would advise the world's top hedge funds and family offices. And we had this leading indicator for US wages, which was supposed to give you an advanced read 6 months in terms of where wages are going. And that matters to investors because, of course, that's a huge part of corporate profits, and it's sort of the inverse. And we're seeing, record corporate profits, and the inverse of that is declining wages. So we were looking at this indicator, and it kept saying, oh, wages are supposed to rise, wages are going to rise, and the data kept coming in, and wages were stagnating and flatlining, and so we had to admit that we were wrong to our clients, and that was part of what prompted the investigation into our research. And so, it's also important to keep in mind that we're not just talking about full-time employees here, but there's been a huge movement towards contractual labor and, the gig economy. And we think of the gig economy like Uber, but also, Google, I think it's more around 50% of their workforce now is contract labor. So they're, especially in the United States where you don't have any benefits associated, it's really problematic for so many workers. I also work with Bloomberg Beta. They commissioned which is the venture capital arm of Bloomberg, they commissioned a big study and found that it was something like upwards of 62% of American workers, were concerned about a $500 expense, a surprise expense. They couldn't cover a $500 surprise expense. This has real, far-reaching economic consequences for the vast majority. There's been a huge hollowing out of the middle class. So, yeah, I'm really concerned about the point in history that we are now, and how this oligopolization of industries has played a role in that economic decline.
Because I work in TV where they literally go black into commercial, you each have 30 seconds if you'd like to weigh in, because I do think we go black here shortly.
Sorry.
Okay, you're wasting 5 seconds. Go ahead.
Can I say quickly, I think it's very important to remember that monopolies models are extractive. They're not making, they're taking, they're extracting, and that's extracting from workers because your labor is, a labor market is a market, so the less people that are trying to buy your labor, the lower price will be. So they extract from workers, they extract from suppliers. When they're the only buyer, they can squeeze the margins of suppliers. They extract from consumers, they extract from taxpayers because they're able to use their political power to, create laws that benefit them.
You have 10 seconds.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm sorry.
I think the thought I want to leave everyone with, and that inspires me to be part of this discussion as well, is that it's platforms like this that allow us to have the dialogue that we have to be able to sort of regulate or not regulate, but make the right decisions for the future. And I think for that, I thank IWF, and I think this is a great opportunity, and I hope we just continue this discussion.
And leave it to an all-woman panel to have 13 seconds until we go black. I'd like to give an oh yeah to this group. Thank you so much. Great job. Thank you.